Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to my updated tutorial on how to trim a tarot or oracle deck. Today we're going to talk about the best practices, tips, and techniques, as well as my step-by-step trimming process that I've honed over the last few years. So today we're actually going to be trimming a copy of the Llewellyn Tarot as we go through this tutorial and this process. To start with, we're going to talk about the tools that we need. So the first thing that you'll need is, of course, a trimmer, something to cut your deck with. Scissors are also a great option. I prefer this Fisker's guillotine trimmer. It's just my favorite and one that I've used pretty consistently over the last few years. You will need a corner rounder to finish off your deck if you'd like to get these nice rounded corners. Now those are the two main things that you need to trim a deck. A few of things that I have added over the years is a triangle ruler to create a guide on the other side, which we'll see here in just a minute, some washi tape or removable tape to hold that down, and a ruler, a straight ruler. I use one that I make sure is the same width between my blade and my guide so that I can see exactly where that blade's going to come down at, and of course the deck that you want to trim. So if you do want a more in-depth look at the tools that I use to modify my decks, I do have a separate deck mod tools video, which I will leave linked for you in the description box below. So the process I follow for trimming any deck is basically a three-step process. There is the planning process where we take a look at what we're actually going to trim and what we're going to do. Then we have the actual trimming process where we're going to cut the borders off the deck. And then we have the finishing process, which is things like rounding the corner. And then of course, if you want to edge the deck, that would also be a continuation of that process. So the first thing that we want to do is actually plan our deck mod. So in this step, we're really going to take a look at the deck, which I have obviously 3 different variations of the Llewellyn Tarot, and we're going to take a look at what we might want to do with that deck. So today we're going to be trimming this copy, which is a brand new copy, and it does have the full borders. Now it's important to note that this cardstock is a little bit different than these two. These are a little bit older edition, and this edition has the sort of newer Llewellyn cardstock. So that is something to keep in mind when you're looking at trimming a deck. We definitely want to keep the cardstock in mind. Different cardstocks will cut and corner round differently, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. A really thick cardboardy type deck might be a little bit more difficult or take a little bit more pressure to trim than the thinner, more flexible cards. And certainly when you get into things like plastic decks, that's a whole nother ball game, totally possible, and which I have done. And if you want to take a look at one of those, check out the mod with me on the Fluorescent Tarot, which is a plastic deck. So when we're looking at a deck to mod, generally what we're doing is we're looking at maybe 4 different things that we might like to do to a deck. Sometimes we do all of them, sometimes just 1 or 2. The most popular thing when trimming a deck is to just remove the borders. So you can see here that this deck has actually quite beautiful and intricate borders. I do have another copy of this deck, which is mine, that I am keeping full size with the borders and everything. The most popular reason to trim a deck is usually to remove those borders. So some other reasons we might want to actually trim a deck is to remove gilding. Now, a lot of decks these days are coming with this super shiny gilding. I am personally not a fan. It hurts my hands, and pretty much whenever I get a deck that has this super shiny, what I call cheap gilding on it, I generally take that off. And I can do so by just trimming off the slightest little edge of the deck. And I do have a couple of videos on that whole process. There was a video where I trimmed 3 decks that all had gilding, and I do believe it is called Goodbye Gilding. So that's another reason why we might want to trim a deck. Another reason is just to make cards smaller. So this is a recent deck mod that I did, and this is the new edition of the Tarot of the Trees, and this is a massive tarot deck. Now, I always had intended to trim this deck down completely borderless, but the trimming also made the cards quite a bit smaller. Before, they were even larger than this, and you can see them in comparison to these decks. It is a massive deck. So sometimes trimming it down, taking the borders off, actually makes the deck smaller as well, so that you can work with it a little bit more easily. Another reason that we might want to trim a deck is to actually change the shape of a deck. So this is the Archetypes deck. It is originally a round deck, and I do not get along with round decks. I'm just not coordinated enough to use them, and so whenever I get a round deck, I like to kind of turn it into this sort of square-ish type deck or rectangle type deck. I do have, again, another mod with me on the Archetypes deck if you want to check that out. But that's another reason why we might want to trim a deck, is to just remove the borders altogether, like we see here on this version of the Llewellyn Tarot, to maybe make it a little bit smaller, like we see here on this version of the Llewellyn, to remove the gilding, or maybe just to change the actual shape of a card. So those are kind of the four main reasons why people trim a deck. Of course, there are all kinds of personal reasons why we might want to trim a deck as well. Sometimes taking the borders off really helps free up that artwork. It makes it more inviting, it opens it up. A lot of times the borders can feel really restrictive, particularly the plain white borders, which do have a tendency to kind of just close in a deck. And so a lot of times people like to remove those to just open up or free the artwork, as we like to say. So if you've never trimmed a tarot deck before, there are a couple of things that I recommend starting out before you jump into trimming your first deck. The first is to practice on a cheap set of playing cards. This allows you to get to know your new tools, especially if you're using a new trimmer or you're doing this process for the very first time. It allows you to get to know them so you can kind of get a feel for how each one works. I have found that each trimmer does actually have a little bit of a different feel to it and a little bit of a different cut. So it's really helpful to kind of get to know your tools before you actually start cutting into your decks. Now, another thing that you can do if you are unsure about how you want to go about trimming your deck is to make a color copy, a full-size color copy of your card, and actually practice on that printout. So if you print it out a couple of different times, you can practice trimming it down to maybe taking it down to completely borderless or down to just 2 sides or 3 sides, and you can look and see how that card's actually going to work for you. If you are tech savvy, you can also do the same thing by throwing a card in a scanner, putting it on your computer, taking it into Photoshop, and then manipulating it from there. Another great thing to do is go online and look for photos and videos of the deck that you're in particular looking at trimming, so that you can see some of the different options and some of the different ways that other people have trimmed it. There is also a great group on Facebook called Tarot with Scissors, and they do a ton of deck modding in that group, and you can generally find people who have modded something similar to what you're looking to modify yourself. And finally, wrapping up our planning process, the very last thing we're going to do before we actually dive into trimming our deck is that we're going to look for the most challenging card. Now, this is the card that has the most difficult aspect of it. Oftentimes this is the card with the longest title. That might be a consideration if you're looking to leave the titles on but take the 3 sides off or 2 of the sides off. Things like places where the artwork overextends into the border. And another great thing to look for is places where your borders are uneven. It's very rare that you find a deck where every card is printed exactly in the same spot as on all 78 cards. Because a lot of these decks, particularly the mass market ones, they're printed in big runs, and you don't necessarily get cards from the exact same run every time. Printing on the actual card can shift sometimes pretty wildly. If you want to see how that process actually works and how you account for that, check out my deck mod on the Mystical Goddesses Tarot. That one had multiple areas going on with the borders. That was definitely a really challenging deck to mod because of where the artwork sat on all the cards. It shifted from stack to stack, and it was definitely one that I had to take a lot of time in pre-planning to figure out where I needed to trim. So if you're thinking about just basically taking a deck down and trimming off the borders, there's a couple of different options that you have. You can, of course, just go borderless like we see here, and this is my very beloved 10th edition Llewellyn. And I have trimmed this one down completely borderless. This is another case where I think the taking the borders off really help to kind of free that artwork up. So here we have an example of the same deck, basically trimmed down to what would essentially be 3 sides. However, the person who trimmed this deck did leave this nice little thin border on both sides as well. So it really does create a nice little frame for it. We haven't really changed too much of the border itself. We've just kind of made it a little bit smaller. So there's a little less border to contend with. If you can see here, they trimmed it down, just taking some off of all 4 sides just to make it a bit smaller, a little bit more manageable, and kind of free it up a little bit from the borders. But you can see in this option, we still maintain the titles on the top and bottom. And that's a nice option if you're wanting to kind of take the borders down a little bit, or you're wanting to make the deck a little bit smaller. That's a great option. A lot of times people will just trim off the 2 sides and leave the top and bottoms, which allow you to retain any titles. So another option would be to trim 3 of the sides off, so your top and 2 sides, and leave your titles. This works really well if you want to keep the titles on your deck and your deck only does have text on the bottom. Now, a lot of times with decks, you have the main tarot associations on one end or the other, and then you have titles that are more related to the deck itself on the other side. And so at that point, you can decide whether or not you want to leave those, or possibly just take off the related titles and leave just the tarot association, or the other way around. You could take off the tarot association, leave the titles that are specific to the deck, still use it as a tarot, or perhaps at that point use it as an oracle. Now, of course, this same exact process really does apply to oracle decks. Generally, you're just, again, going to still look for those areas where your titles might impede, where your borders have shifted, where your artwork is slightly off-centered. All of these tips that I'm going to talk about today, even though we're going to be trimming a tarot deck, do apply to oracle as well, so you can use them basically on any type of card. So that's kind of the first phase of the process, is really just sitting down, deciding what we want to do with the cards, kind of taking a look, maybe doing some practice runs with some printing off cards and trying some different trims, looking up other videos or photos of people who've trimmed that same deck and kind of seeing what they've done, so you can decide how you want to approach your deck. Again, if it's your first time trimming, you'll definitely want to do a little bit of practice trimming first to get to know your tools and the way the whole process works. And I also recommend that if you are doing this for the first time, that you start with a tarot deck that, 1, you don't care if it gets messed up, and 2, you can easily replace if you need to. So please do not start this process with your very rare out of print tarot decks. It really does take a little bit of time to get pretty good at this process. However, if you follow the step-by-step process, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, it does usually come out pretty dang close every single time. But I do recommend that you start with a inexpensive mass market deck that you're not overly attached to if it's your first time out. Just think of that as your practice deck. And finally, before we really dive into actually cutting into these cards, we're definitely going to go through and look for our most challenging card. The other consideration is what's going on the back of the cards. Now, sometimes cards have things like specific designs or lines or things of that nature that might impede your trim. So if you're trimming and the back is important to you and what it looks like is important to you, always keep that in mind. So sometimes you get those decks that have like lines on the back or things of that nature that really could impede how you are able to trim the deck, because the back printing doesn't line up with the front printing. So say you trim the white border off the front, sometimes that ends up leaving a white border still remaining in places on the back. So just kind of flip your deck over, take a look at the back. It really does depend on how important maintaining the integrity of the back of the card design on the back is to you. And that will kind of determine actually what you end up doing to the front of the cards as well. So if, for example, the white border on this particular card was larger on the front, was larger on the back than it was on the front, then if I trimmed off the white border here, I might end up with a sort of micro white border around the back. In that case, I might actually flip the deck over and trim it according to the back so that I make sure that I get all of that white off. Again, you just want to double check if you're doing something like that you're not going to be inadvertently cutting off titles that you want to leave on. So it's really important to just take your time and plan out your mod. All right, so now that we have talked about the planning process, let's get into the actual trimming process. So I have gone through this process in pretty much every mod with me that I've done in the last year, because this is a process that I have really honed over the last few years to get a really straight, and I always say as humanly possible, because it is impossible to get a absolutely perfect trim when you're trimming by hand. And even using a guillotine or any sort of a trimming tool still is you doing it by hand. So you're never gonna get an absolutely perfect cut, but using this process, you can get pretty dang close. So one of the things that I want to really stress in this process is the idea of cutting one side at a time for all 78 cards, or however many's in your oracle. That is how you get a precise cut. That is how you get a nice clean cut, a clean finish on the edge. And that really does make the deck shuffle better. When you have a deck that the cards are not all quite the same size, it really doesn't shuffle very well. But actually using the sort of measurement system and really lining things up and cutting everything at exactly the same size really does help get that sort of almost perfect, pretty close to like this machine cut here. Again, it's never gonna be quite this nice because we are cutting by hand, even though we're using tools. So as I mentioned, the most important step in this process is actually taking the time to cut each of the cards by size and setting your measurements before you begin. So this is where my handy triangle ruler comes in. Now you can use any sort of straight edged thing, any sort of straight edge ruler or thing to create a guide. I like the little triangle ruler because it has a nice 90-degree angle, so it butts up against this little ledge here and it creates a nice line down the other side. And basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a cradle to pop all of these cards in. And so that means when I actually go through the process of trimming, once I get it set for each side, it's actually pretty quick because I'm not having to actually stop and measure every time I turn the card around. I'm just gonna cut all of the cards on the right side at this first measurement. Then I'm gonna flip the deck around, reset my measurements, and cut all of the left side, and so on and so forth, repeating the process for however many sides that you want to trim off. This part is key to getting a really, really straight cut. And really, once you get the hang of this, you do this enough times, this process actually goes really stinking fast because you don't have to be really careful and measure every single cut. So for this, I'm also going to use my handy washi tape. I prefer washi, but that could just be because that's what I have on hand. The thing I do like about washi is that it always lifts off my cards, so I don't have to worry about it taking anything up with it, and it holds everything down really well. Any sort of removable tape would probably work really well. You just want to make sure that it's not something that's going to pull up any layers on your board or of course any of the coating on your deck. So we've got our washi tape. We're going to get a couple pieces of those going, and then we're going to basically measure out where our first cut is going to be. So I'm going to start with the right side of the deck. So the first thing I'm going to do is put one of my cards in here. We're going to move these guys out of the way for a moment. And I'm going to use the guide to kind of eyeball my first measurement. And I think I probably want it right about there. And this is where my extra ruler comes in handy because I can use it to actually show me where that's going to come down on the card, because the width of this ruler is the same as the distance between the plastic guard here and the actual blade. So the first thing I'm going to do is line that up, and I'm going to check that. Now with this particular deck, we have multiple borders going on. we actually have the main sort of parchment paper outer border and then this little brown inner border. I generally cut to the inside of these little micro borders because even if I were to get a really, really straight cut and manage to maintain all of these little mini borders around the outside of the cards, once I corner round into that, I'm gonna lose it on the corner. So for me, I don't like to keep the little micro borders that are on the inside of the cards because, again, I would end up with basically micro border in various thicknesses because, again, remember that printing is going to shift and vary just slightly from card to card, or sometimes wildly depending on the deck. And so if I were to try to maintain that micro border, I would get where some places it's thicker than others, and then in all my corners, my border would basically be gone. Total personal preference. But I just prefer to go ahead and trim to the inside of the micro border and just basically take it off along with the outer border as well. Now, if the inner border is really, really thick, then maybe you might want to consider holding on to that and retaining it. Just keep in mind that when you corner round it, you are going to be cutting into that a little bit. So I'm kind of liking where that's sitting. The other thing you can do is kind of check a few cards just to see where that printing is going to hit. So on this particular card, the printing is much more scooted over to the left than it is on this card. It doesn't appear like it when we're just eyeballing it, but my ruler is telling me that on this card, I'm just to the inside of that brown inner border. And on this card, I'm actually going to lose a little bit of the artwork, which means that over here, I'm probably going to have the same issue. So I like to check a couple of different cards and from a couple of different places in the deck, because sometimes you get decks that the print runs are different through half of the deck. So again, see, this one is again shifted more to the left. So if I trim right here, I'm gonna lose a little bit more of this border. Now, by a little bit, I do mean a little bit. I mean like just a little sliver. I know I don't always show this whole process on my Mod With Me's because those are more of a kind of, well, I'd say quicker, but some of them are quite long. But as we're doing this one as an actual tutorial, I'm going to go super in depth into every little detail of my process. So for the most part, I'm pretty happy with where this one sits. It is right on the border for this particular card, but it does shift a little bit more for the others. Now, the reason that we're doing measurements is because if I were just to cut the border off on all of these cards without setting a measurement, those cards that I said that they were shifted more over to the left, they're going to be off center and they're going to be smaller or slightly a different size than the first card that I cut here, because those borders are not always in the same spot. And that's where you get those inconsistencies when you're trimming, is when you are just following the printing on the card itself, because that varies from card to card. So that's how come you get the kind of, if you see here actually in this one, can you see everywhere where we get that shadow effect? Those are where cards are larger than the other ones. There's definitely inconsistencies in this particular trimming, and this is because this deck was one of the first decks I trimmed, and I did it without using measurements. So thus the reason it's super uneven. So now that I'm pretty happy with where that is sitting, I've used some washi just to hold that in place while I set my guide up here. And you want to be careful, like I just did. I pushed this in too hard, and it kind of shifted my card slightly to the right. So I'm gonna line everything up really carefully, and I'm going to, I've just removed that washi just to double check that that's lined in there straight. I'm using this as a guide, because as you can see, because I've only got it taped down there, if I'm not really spot on, it will shift. And then I'm basically using washi to tape this down and get it just hold down really well so that I make sure that it doesn't shift while I'm cutting. The other thing you want to keep in mind is to not put your washi anywhere where it will catch or impede on your trimming. I have had it where it's come over to this side a little bit, and then it catches my card and then will basically move the whole thing. So now that I've got that guide in there, I can just pop the card in and I can check where it's gonna be. And again, I'm just gonna check a couple of them just to make sure. So now that I've got that in there, basically I'm going to make my first cut. And so now that I've created this guide or this cradle, all I have to do is slide my card in here, make sure that it is, you know, pressed up against here nicely, that everything's lined up properly. And then I need to tape that side down. So I am going to tape the top down here as well, because I want to make sure that my card doesn't accidentally end up sliding underneath my little corner guide that I've created. That definitely can happen with the thinner cardstock. I've had many times where my card is slipped up under my guide and it's thrown off my printing. So now that that's in there, basically all we have left to do is make sure everything is in there nice and neat, and then cut the sides. So I like to make multiple points of contact with the card just to make sure it doesn't shift when my blade actually comes down through it. And I'm also holding this guide down to make sure it doesn't shift as well. And we'll make that first cut. So there you can see I got just to the inside of that border. That might actually not even show up on camera. And there is my one borderless side. So now, rather than taking this card and flipping it around and trying to trim the other side, what I'm gonna do is just trim all of these cards down to that one side. That way, they're all going to be at the same size. So you can see here, on this particular one, we'll see if it'll show up on camera, I took just the slightest little bit more off because again, that printing has shifted. Again, we're talking like minuscule amounts, but it does happen. So now that I have kind of got that where I like it, I can actually maybe pop through the deck and try, that's another major. Let's try a couple of different suits and stuff just to make sure that everything is still right where I want it to be. And I am happy with where that is cutting. Of course, after you cut your first card, if you want to make any adjustments to your where your ruler is sitting, that would be the time to do that. Shift it around, recut your first card, and then you can go on. It's of course important to remember that you should always err on the side of caution, because while you can always take more off, you can't put it back on, of course, right? So now let's go ahead and finish trimming up this side. Maybe we'll do it real time so you can see how fast it actually goes. Okay, so I wasn't actually paying attention to the time because I was focusing on cutting, but I think that just took a couple minutes. And you can see here that, well, let's go this way. I've got a pretty nice straight cut here. It looks pretty flush. Now, the couple of things that I was thinking about as I was cutting that I want to make sure to mention is that as you are cutting, one of the things that I always do, for one, before I start, is put all of my cards in my deck upright. I don't read reversals, but always want to make sure they're all facing the same way so that every cut is the same on the correct side. So every time I put a card in here, before I actually bring the blade down, I always double check, is it the right way? Now, obviously, when I'm cutting the right side, it all needs to be right side up. When I go to cut the other side, it will all need to be basically reversed. And so that's one of the things that I definitely keep in mind. Another thing, before you move your guide here that you've created for this right side, I just like to go through and check the cards and see if there's anywhere where I see that border remaining. And you can actually go through each and every card if you want. But basically what I'm looking for is anywhere that I didn't quite cut enough and the border is still on there. This one is looking pretty good so far. And as you can see, I don't really worry about trying to keep my cards in order while I'm doing this process because I end up making piles all over the place. So far I'm only seeing one where there's just a sliver of border, and I do mean like a millimeter. It's tiny. So now that I've checked those, basically what I'm gonna do is throw these ones back into the trimmer and just kind of double check that nothing else comes off if I try to basically trim it again. And see that one, I did get the tiniest sliver off, and so that was the issue with that one. Sometimes they do shift just a little bit. It really does kind of depend on your cardstock. That one I got just a tiny bit at the end. The glossier or slipperier the cardstock, the more likelihood that it will slip around on your trimmer a little bit. So again, I just double check those, and like that's literally what I took off. Just really micro trimming there, and I put those on there the wrong way. Again, always making sure all your cards are going the right way. So now that I have done that, I also always like to put them flat against the table and look, are there any cards that are popping up and look like maybe they didn't get trimmed enough, because sometimes that happens as well. And again, they're not going to be perfect, but they're going to be pretty dang close. I can see there's one card in here that is a little bit shorter than the rest. That should, for the most part, fix itself when I flip around the other side, because now I'm going to use a second measurement to cut them down, and that's going to help even things back out again. So basically, I'm just going to repeat the same process as we did the first time. I'm going to pull this up, and I have found that it's easier to just kind of, as much as I want to kind of just leave the tape on there, trying to readjust it with the tape on there just makes it catch on the board. So I take it all off and I just do it all over again. Tape that down there. And then again, I'm going to use my ruler and recheck. And same thing, I'm going to go through and check a couple of them, because again, that printing shifts a little bit. And because this particular card was further to the left than it was to the right, that means that it's going to be a little bit closer on this side on the other cards, if that makes sense. So I'm pretty happy with where that is. So I'm going to go ahead and start trimming these. So there you go. You can see that is what I took off. Another thing you might have noticed was that every so often I was moving this pile. I find that if I let too many of them get piled up under here, they can actually impede my blade and get in my way. So every once in a while, I kind of pull that pile out and move it out of the way. So I'm gonna do a couple of these just to make sure that I like where it's coming down well enough. Again, always trying to make sure I'm keeping my cards going the same way. Yeah, I like where those are coming down. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish trimming this side, and then we'll check back in. So I said we would check back in, but we're gonna check back in right now because I came across a very common issue in that the measurements that I used for this Three of Swords worked well until I got to this Magician, and now I have a slight border left on this one. So what I'm gonna do at this point to make sure that I get this completely borderless, yes, I could leave that. It is like a millimeter, maybe a half. I mean, it's tiny. But just to show you that you can make adjustments as you're going, what I'm gonna do is reset this according to this card now, and then retrim these 4 cards using the new measurement. Okay, so I've basically moved that over just the tiniest bit. And now I'm going to take that sliver off, as you can see there. But now that I've done that, it's really important, if I want everything to be the same size, that I go back and trim these 4 cards that I'd already initially done to this new measurement. That's what keeps everything as close to straight as possible. So I'm just gonna put these ones back in here, take off that little bit more. And again, if the backs are important to you, don't forget to, you know, keep an eye on what's going on with your backs. So now I've trimmed off that excess of those, and at this point, I like to check, and oh, they're looking nice and straight, so that's great. Okay, so now I'm gonna finish up trimming that, this one side, and then we'll check back in. Okay, so at this point I have both of the sides trimmed off the deck, and you can see now we're at the point or the opportunity where you can decide if you want to leave the tops and bottoms, the title areas, or maybe if you want to do like this deck has been done, where you just trim off a little bit of the extra just to kind of clean it up and make it a little smaller, because you can see that there is quite a bit of extra space above and below these titles. So one of the reasons that I always start with the sides is because there generally is never text on the sides. And so I can cut the both sides off and get it down completely borderless, or maybe just a thin border like we saw in this particular deck. And then I can decide at this point, am I sure that I want to take those titles off? Because there have been occasions where I've thought I was going to do a deck completely borderless. The Dreaming Way Tarot comes to mind. My original intention was to go completely borderless with that deck, but I found that once I got the two sides cut off and then the top cut off, which was basically all the extra white space, I actually liked just having the title at the bottom. So I ended up leaving them. So at this point we can decide, okay, I like it being borderless. I don't want the titles at the top, but I'm still unsure about the titles at the bottom. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the tops off now, and I'm going to leave the bottoms for last. And that's generally what I do, because I pretty much like to get a deck down to just pretty much borderless with just the titles at the bottom. And then, or I suppose the top, depending on where they've chosen to put them, and then make that decision at that point of whether or not I want to take those titles off. Because once you take a title off, it's done, it's gone. I do want to mention the other thing that is really handy about using the guide is that it does, for the most part, keep you from accidentally cutting off things that you didn't mean to cut off. So I've heard of a lot of people who have been just, you know, going through the process, you know, trimming up their decks, because you kind of get into this little routine or rhythm with it. Maybe they're watching some videos like I do, and they accidentally cut off a title that they didn't mean to cut off. They hadn't intended to cut the titles off of the deck, and now they've accidentally cut it off one card, so now you have to make the deck borderless, basically, right? You can't put the title back on. So one of the reasons that I like also doing this little cradle method here with the guide is because I'm very intentional about where each cut is going to be, and I know that I'm not going to accidentally cut off a title, because if I haven't set the measurements to be cutting off the title on the bottom, it's not going to cut it off, if that makes sense. Just kind of helps keep you from accidentally cutting off things you didn't mean to cut off. So at this point, I'm going to basically repeat this whole process. I'm going to reset my guide, and I'm going to trim the tops off so we can leave the bottoms to make that final decision at the end. Again, I've got that about where I think I want it. When I go this way, I can actually get that corner down, which is wonderful. So now I'm just going to check a couple of the cards. Just going to kind of tape that down a little bit more and make my cut. And that did get the top off. So I'm going to go ahead and trim the tops off, and then we'll check back in. So I have trimmed this deck down, taken off 3 sides, and the titles are still at the bottom. Now looking at this, I'm thinking I kind of like the titles at the bottom. I think that that's a great way to get really free up the artwork and to let it really be open and breathe and not quite constrained by those big borders, but still allows you to see what card that it is. If I had taken off the titles first, I wouldn't have been able to see it in this manner and to make that final decision. And now that I've trimmed it down like that, I've decided I'm going to leave it. However, if I did want to make it borderless like this one here, I could just basically repeat the process and take the bottoms off, and there we have it. So that is basically how you trim a tarot deck. Using the little cradle with the guide really helps to get things really nice and straight. You can see here, hopefully, that for the most part, this is really good and straight. You know, on occasion, a couple cards that are like, ooh, that one got a little bit shorter, but that's okay. Again, probably just because it shifted slightly on my trimmer because these are a little bit glossier. But again, still a really nice, pretty straight cut. Definitely better than this particular one, which was cut basically without any measurements and just, you know, throwing it in there, flipping it around all 4 ways, and there we go. You can totally do that, but this method actually works a lot better for creating a deck that is a lot straighter, a lot smoother, and will shuffle better as well. So we're gonna call this one good on the trimming. Another thing I did want to mention is I always keep these little guys if I'm going to be edging a deck, because these are wonderful for testing not only your inks on to see how you might want to edge the deck, but also your corner rounders as well. So we're kind of moving on to the finishing process now, where we're actually going to corner round this deck and kind of give it that nice rounded corners, the softer look, kind of just finish it up. For that, I use the Katamaro Pro trimmer because it has the 3 different sizes, the small, medium, and large, which allows me to kind of decide what size I want to use. Now, the thing I want to mention about using one of these that has multiple sizes is, for one, test it first to see which each of the sizes are. When I very first got this, I basically took an index card and I trimmed out the corners in the 3 sizes and marked which ones they were so that I could use that as a guide when trying to determine which size I want to use. Your little cast-offs are also great for that too. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're unsure, start with the smallest one first and work your way up, because you can always take off more. You can't put it back. So here is the small. So I'm going to tuck that in there and trim the small one so we can see how that will look. And then we'll trim a medium one and finally a large one. Now, I tend to use the medium most of all. I tend to use the smaller one only when I have a really small pocket size deck. Medium is kind of my standard, and large is the size that I tend to use for oracles or really large decks. So we have the small, the medium, and the large. You can see hopefully the size difference. The small is definitely a more squared corner. The medium is kind of more of your traditional tarot size, the round that we tend to see on a tarot size, and large is kind of a little bit more closer to what we see on an oracle size. Now at this point, what I can do is actually flip these around and kind of use it to kind of determine, do I want to use the small? That's really going to keep the cards really, really square. If I use the medium, that's going to give them a little bit of a softer edge, but still keep it fairly square. And if I go with the large, that's going to round a lot of that corner, and that would make for a really kind of rounded, soft deck. Now, sometimes I like to use the large on a small deck to really soften it up, but I think this time we'll just go with the standard medium. Again, I will be holding on to these when I actually go to edge this deck, because I can test different colors and materials, different supplies on these, and see how the ink takes to the cardstock, as well as the colors that it's going to come out. So to finish up this deck, all we have to do is basically put all of our cards into our corner rounder and round them off just like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish up rounding this deck. My hand does sometimes get a little bit sore with this, and so sometimes I usually do it in batches. I'll do a few cards at a time, usually like around a third of the deck, take a little break, come back and do another third, and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna finish these up, and then we will wrap up this tutorial. Okay, I've got this all corner rounded, so what I'm gonna do is line them up and look for anywhere where I've got a little bit of a jaggedy bit, because sometimes when you're going through the whole process, Sometimes you don't quite get the card in there as well as you think you did. Like there's a couple. If I'm going to be edging a deck, I generally can tell once I start edging the corners that I didn't quite get all the way into the corner rounder. So I usually keep my corner rounder on hand. I almost always edge a deck after I've trimmed it. And so I usually remember what size I used, but if I am not going to be edging it right after I trim it, I sometimes make a little note of which size I used. I could also just punch a piece of cardstock first to see which size it is so that I can use that to clean up any edges that I didn't quite get into the corner rounder the first time. So there we have it, all completely trimmed up. I did end up leaving the titles on because I think that does actually look rather nice. Let's real quick just go through what our process was. We started with the planning process where we kind of looked at what we wanted to do with our deck and how we wanted to trim it. We looked for the most challenging card first, so that allowed us to find any cards where the titles might have been in the way, or certainly since I did end up leaving the titles on the bottom, that would have been really important to note. If any of these titles had extended beyond, if they had rather large titles and extended beyond into these side areas that I cut off, I could have lost whole words or portions of words. Then we went into the trimming process where we used our guide to set our measurements. We cut one side on all 78 cards at a time, and that allowed us to get them all cut to the same size. And then finally, we finished it off with corner rounding, always, testing our corners first to see which size we like, starting with the smallest and working our way up if we need to. So that is basically the process of how I go about trimming a deck. And just so you can see here, because I have so many copies of this deck, we can see the Llewellyn Tarot trimmed in a couple of different ways. Here we have the original with the full borders. This is my backup copy, so it is still in plastic. Then we have this copy here that has been trimmed down just to make it a tiny bit smaller with a little bit taken off all of the sides, basically. We have a little trim on the top, a little trim on the bottom, and a trim on two sides. This one I did not trim. I actually traded for this one because it is the same cardstock as the deck that I absolutely love. This one we just trimmed and we left the borders just on the bottom, making it borderless on the three sides. And then of course we have this original deck that I trimmed, which is the completely borderless one with all four sides taken off. So there you can see the Llewellyn Tarot trimmed in 3 different ways and what it'll look like originally. So before we wrap up, let's talk about a couple of the best practice tips that I have kind of discovered over the years. The first one is use the right tools. It's really important that you use good tools for this process. Whether you're going to be using a guillotine trimmer or a pair of scissors, make sure that you're using good proper tools. Make sure that your tools are sharp and won't have any trouble cutting through whatever type of cardstock you're working with. Then of course, it's really important to plan your mod. So know what you want to do before you sit down to do it. Do a little bit of research if you need. Take a look at some other photos of the deck modded up in the way that you're considering doing it, or just take your time and go slow like we did with this one, doing one side at a time, which not only gives you the correct size for your measurements, but it also gives you the opportunity to see the deck kind of evolve through the process, so that if at any point during the process you are looking at the deck and going, yep, that's it, that's what I want, you can stop right there. So another thing is to always trim the title areas off last. That way, if you get to the point like we did here where I decided I wanted to leave those, you haven't started with that and pretty much have determined that now you have to make your entire deck borderless. Doing one side at a time also really helps to make sure that you keep your deck as cut straight as humanly possible, and it also kind of helps you from accidentally cutting off things that you don't want to cut off because you're only working with one side at a time and you've created a guide or a cradle using your other tools to ensure that you're always just working on that one side at a time. Keeps you from accidentally slicing off those titles in case you wanted to use them. And of course, when you're using your corner rounder, make sure that you test the corners first to see which one that you like. Always start with the smallest one and work your way up if you're unsure, because just like with trimming, you can always take off more, but you can't put it back. So I hope that following this process will help you to create some beautifully trimmed deck. Be sure to check out my Deck Mod Tutorials playlist for other creative ways to customize your decks. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for everything featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.